A freighter carrying a crew of 29 disappeared on Lake Superior during a severe storm last night, and so far, no survivors have been found.
For 50 years, you've been told a storm slew the Edmund Fitzgerald's 29 crewmen. But that's not the truth. What if the real cause was buried in Coast Guard files and ignored maintenance logs?
It's 40 years since the famous storm that sank the ore carrier, the Edmund Fitzgerald. The wreck happened just north of Whitefish Point.
You're here because you suspect official reports don't tell the whole story, and you want the truth uncovered. Today, we'll dig into evidence hidden for decades, exposing a cover-up that turned tragedy into a convenient myth. We'll trace the Fitzgeralds' proud history, reveal overlooked warning signs, reconstruct her final hours, and break down why the official narrative was never the full truth. Pride of the Great Lakes. In the late 1950s, the Great Lakes shipping industry was in the midst of a golden age. Steel demand was high, the economy was booming, and companies were racing to build bigger, faster, and more efficient vessels to dominate the iron ore trade. When the Edmund Fitzgerald slid into the water in 1958, she wasn't just another freighter, she was a statement. At 729 feet long, she was the largest ship ever to sail the inland seas, and to many, she was a floating marvel of engineering. Owned by the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company and leased to the Columbia Transportation Division of Oglebay Norton, the Fitzgerald quickly became the jewel of the Great Lakes. Her very name carried weight. Edmund Fitzgerald, the company's president, took personal pride in the vessel, attending her christening and visiting her often. It wasn't unusual to see executives boasting about her record-breaking performance to clients and newspapers alike. The Fitzgerald could carry over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets, more than any other ship on the lakes, and she did so with a grace that made her a favorite among captains and crew. In those early years, she set seasonal cargo records, often finishing the shipping season as the top hauler on the lakes. Other than that, the ship had a personality. Under the first captain, Peter Pulser, the Fitzgerald was gaining appreciation not only for its speed and reliability, but for some showmanship. Pulser would play music over the ship's PA, keeping up the crew morale and entertaining passing boats. While going through the locks, he would shout trivia and fun facts over a bullhorn to his admirers, making the ship a floating spectacle as well as a freighter. Locals along her path learned to spot that silhouette on the horizon, while children would run to the shore and watch her slip by. The Fitzgerald was much more than just a place of work for the men who sailed her. It was a pride. The stewards proudly claimed to turn out the finest food in the fleet. Plain deckhands would go on and on about the ship's steady motion in heavy seas. The officers loved her for her responsiveness. She was built to work hard for a long time. Many had thought that she would still be hauling ore deep into the 21st century. Pride, hollowed by arguments in silence. The Fitzgerald was one ship that was too heavy and too strong to talk about adventuring into genuine danger. She had faced tremendous storms before and had sipped, albeit lightly, the waters of passing storms. Captains and crews became ever more convinced that for whichever height of wave or strength of wind, the Fitzgerald could take it without harming herself. This was confidently established by having an all-clean safety record during the first 10 years of her life. Each successful crossing only added to the mystique of invincibility, further over most others. That image was not just to the men on board, it was extended to the shipping companies, the insurance firms, and the public. She became a marketing tool, a living example of the strength and stability of Great Lakes commerce. And when you have a ship seen as unsinkable, the tendency is to push her harder. The schedules tighten, turnarounds in port get shorter, minor repairs are postponed because there is always another load to deliver. Fitzgerald became a symbol of efficiency, but efficiency is not always cheap. In retrospect, that pride cultivated a dangerous blind spot. The pride of the American side reputation made it harder for anyone to imagine she could be in real trouble. The warnings could be dismissed, and the small problems could be downplayed because the Fitzgerald had charged through time and again. The mythology about the power of the ship began to eclipse the truth of her state of being. While more than enough were being broken and won into admiration, fine cracks of a sort, both literal and figurative, had begun to show. One could hardly see them, but they were lurking beneath the coat of paint and polished veneer. In the rough Great Lakes waters, minor problems have been known to claim lives. No one imagined that the very qualities that made her a legend would also make her vulnerable. Cracks beneath the paint. Beneath the gleaming steel hull and the polished image of the Edmund Fitzgerald was a truth the public never saw, a ship that was beginning to show her age in ways that mattered most when the lake turned angry. Outwardly, she was still the pride of the fleet, but those who worked her decks and those who handled her maintenance knew she wasn't flawless. In the years leading up to her final voyage, small but critical problems had begun to surface, and not all of them were being addressed with the urgency they deserved. Like every freighter on the Great Lakes, the Fitzgerald took a beating from the elements: ice in winter, heat in summer, and the constant flexing of her hull in heavy seas put enormous stress on her structure. Cracks in welds, corrosion in critical joints, and the loosening of deck fittings were not unusual in the industry. The difference was in how ship owners chose to deal with them. And when a ship is hauling record loads, every day in dry dock is a day not making money. Repairs that could be delayed were delayed. Crew members had been growing increasingly vociferous about persistent maintenance issues that included vents that leaked during heavy rains, hatch covers not sealing tightly all the time, and equipment that had only been patched rather than replaced. All these were well recorded in logs. Internal memorandums also miss these to the unobservant eye. The Fitzgerald to date still appears spotless, but to a seafarer who has lived by the years on board, these patches and quick fixes tell a different tale: creeping neglect, not just the wear and tear. The Fitzgerald wore features like none other that made her labor maintenance intensive. The larger-than-life hull would flex dramatically in rough seas compared to the smaller ships. Over time, that flexing might have compromised structural integrity without proper monitoring. The Coast Guard had issued recommendations to reinforce hatch covers on ships of her class, but these updates cost scads. Some companies moved fast. The others, including the Fitzgeralds, took their sweet time. There were also these financial concerns. The 1970s were a period of intense competition for shipping, and owners were keen to squeeze every bit of productivity out of their vessels. The longer a freighter remained idle at port for extended repairs, not earning money, the better it was for the owner. Safety was by no means the last thing on anyone's mind. Inspections were duly done, reports filled out, but the focus was often on getting the ship back to work in the shortest time possible. Repairs that could wait until the off-season would usually do just that: safely endure the busy season. Insiders would later cite maintenance logs from the months preceding November 1975 that dropped hints about unresolved problems. Some entries mentioned corrosion of deck fittings, while others described minor flooding of the compartments during storms. Individually, these conditions may not have been critical, but combined in the right or wrong circumstances, they could have proved fatal. One easily forgets that the Fitzgerald had had its knocks before her last voyage. Grounding happened once or twice during her career, especially for an inevitable case of inspection and repair. Still, no structural damage was officially recorded. Groundings generally weaken the ship in ways that are subtle and may not emerge until the ship stretches its limits. Of course, for the outside world, the Fitzgerald was an immaculate ship, and a carefully preserved reputation for reliability made the schedule complete. But those monitoring operations in the ship knew how far this unsinkable ship really floated from its glossy brochure impression. The cracks weren't just in steel. They were systemic cracks in the system that kept it up. Cracks in priorities weighing speed and profit against prudence and care. The storm may have come suddenly, but the seeds of disaster were planted long before she left port. A voyage into the crosshairs. November 9, 1975, began without drama. The Edmund Fitzgerald sat moored in Superior, Wisconsin, loaded with over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets destined for Zug Island near Detroit. The forecast was favorable, predicting only moderate weather. To seasoned sailors, it looked like a routine late-season run. Cold, yes, but manageable. Captain Ernest M. McSorley, a veteran with more than 4 decades at sea, had made similar trips dozens of times. At 2:15 p.m., the Fitzgerald eased away from the dock and set her bow toward open water. At that moment, the danger didn't lie in what the crew knew, but in what they didn't. 5 hours into the voyage, the National Weather Service updated its forecast. A low-pressure system was deepening and shifting, no longer expected to pass south of Lake Superior. Instead, it would sweep across the entire lake, bringing gale-force winds and massive waves. The change came fast, too fast for some vessels to alter their plans entirely. He made a decision to turn his experience and confidence regarding Fitzgerald's strength towards the Canadian shore. McSorley did not turn back or seek immediate shelter. Rather, he altered the course, directing toward the Canadian shoreline. In principle, the idea was sound. Hug the shore for some degree of protection from wind and waves. But this maneuver also put the Fitzgerald on a longer course through waters that would still become dangerous if the storm intensified faster than expected. Throughout the night, the weather turned worse. By November 10's early hours, winds screamed across the lake at over 50 knots, and waves higher than 10 feet slapped the Fitzgerald's steel hull. Other vessels reported taking hammer spray, which afterwards froze instantly to decks and rails, adding perilous weight to their structure. The Fitzgerald pressed on, her massive bow rising and falling with each swell, sending shudders through her frame. About 2:45 p.m. came yet another complication. Snow. Visibility dropped to near zero. The crew's lifeline was radar, and they slowed to avoid careening ahead blindly into hazards. The Fitzgerald was no longer racing across the lake. She was crawling. A first radio call went out to the SS Arthur M. Anderson, another freighter about 10 miles behind. McSorley was calm but direct. "I have a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list." A list, the ship leaning to one side, meant something down below had shifted, or water had entered where it didn't belong. Losing vents was a terrible sign. It meant that by now, before the flooding of her cargo holds, the storm had already rendered equipment stateside with no force necessary. McSorley had asked Anderson to stay close in case things got worse. The day grew long, with each hour brimming with unstrapped white-knuckled madness. It was during the hour of 7:10 p.m. when the first mate to the Anderson radioed in again, saying that the craft could offer navigation advice and inquired about Fitzgerald's handling of the weather. One McSorley's quote would go down in history: "We are holding our own." That sound would be solid, even comforting, but it would conceal urgent matters. That was the last thing anyone heard from the Fitzgerald. Minutes later, the radar from the Anderson lost her altogether. In the intensifying storm, there was also no visual contact. The call-outs went unanswered. The Fitzgerald disappeared. To the men aboard the Anderson, it was a disquieting realization. They had followed what they thought was an unbreakable ship, only to see it disappear within minutes without so much as a signal of distress. As the snow closed in, so did the clock, and the captain made a gamble that would prove fatal. the fatal gamble. Captain Ernest M. McSorley was not a reckless man. By the fall of 1975, he was in the twilight of his career, a seasoned mariner with more than 40 years of navigating the Great Lakes. He had a reputation for competence, a calm voice on the radio, and a steady hand at the helm. But like many captains of his generation, he was also known for pushing hard to complete a run, even in punishing weather. On the lakes, reputation wasn't just about skill. It was about reliability, delivering cargo on schedule no matter what the sky threw at you. That mindset had served him well before, but the Fitzgeralds' last voyage was different. The storm on November 10th wasn't just a blow, it was a brute force test of every weakness in the ship's structure and every judgment call made that day. By mid-afternoon, McSorley knew his vessel was compromised. The list to one side meant either cargo had shifted or water was finding its way below deck. The damaged vents suggested that openings into the cargo holds were now exposed. On a good day, those issues could be managed. On a night like this, they could turn deadly. Nevertheless, McSorley intended to press on. The Fitzgerald was only about 17 miles from safety, but that was when the squalls were concentrated. If they could reach the bay, it would give them time to assess and perhaps repair in safety. Under the conditions witnessed that night, though, 17 miles was as good as 170. The opposing choice was either to slow down and risk being caught in the heaviest part of the storm with very little control over her, or to keep up the speed and reach shelter before the weather got a whole lot worse. McSorley chose to keep up the speed. The Fitzgerald went ahead with all she had, but each wave that came against the hull had its counteraction from the bow being slammed in 100 gut-wrenching slams. This is perhaps the most complicated condition in which the fierce battleground between the two was cast, the weather itself. And McSorley's reasons for going or not going were bound and influenced by outside cruxes of many kinds. The shipping season was nearing its end. Delays during this time could mean lost days of operation. A master mariner, perhaps, had pride at stake. Turning back or hunkering down might be the safe option, but hardly reputation-saving. It just simply isn't keeping one's reputation intact within this community of today. There was now, as in the old days, an unspoken code among men on the lakes. You brought your ship and crew home on time. But that which McSorley could have remained unsure about was just how badly compromised his vessel might have been before the storm even hit. If water had begun to enter the hold through one or more damaged hatches or vents, every mile traveled forward compounded the flooding. Fitzgerald's ability to ride a wave became less with each ton of water taken on. Out in the cold, churning waters of Lake Superior, the margin of error disappeared. It was not simply an update when McSorley radioed Anderson with, "We're holding our own." Such an utterance defined their plight, but masked the urgency of the situation. Be it to steady his crew, reassure the Anderson, or stave off hopelessness, the effect was the same. Those listening did not realize just how close the Fitzgerald might have been to the breaking point. And then, in those last minutes following the call, something cataclysmic happened. Perhaps a rogue wave, structural failure, or a sudden rushing of already overstressed holds. Now the ship that had held its own is gone, taking all 29 men aboard with it. But it wasn't just one man's decision. The Fitzgerald was built with a flaw that no amount of skill could overcome. The design flaw nobody talked about. The Edmund Fitzgerald was a giant by Great Lakes standards, but her size carried a hidden liability. She was built to haul enormous cargo loads efficiently, yet the very features that made her a record setter also left her vulnerable in the kind of seas she faced on November 10, 1975. Chief among these was her hatch cover system, the steel lids that sealed her cargo holds from the punishing lake above. In calm conditions, the hatch covers worked as intended, keeping the iron ore pellets dry and the ship buoyant. But in rough seas, those covers faced relentless punishment. Waves can slam into a ship's deck with thousands of pounds of force. On the Fitzgerald, the hatch clamps and gaskets were notoriously difficult to keep perfectly sealed. Reports from other ships of her class noted that the clamps could loosen under repeated strain, and if even a small gap formed, water could begin to pour into the holds. In theory, a freighter can handle some flooding. Bilge pumps and drainage systems are designed to keep up with minor leaks. But the Fitzgerald's design left little room for error when it came to water entering her massive cargo holds. A single wave might not be catastrophic, but wave after wave in 35-foot seas could overwhelm pumps in minutes. Worse still, if water mixed with the heavy taconite pellets, it created a sloshing, cement-like weight that shifted unpredictably, destabilizing the entire ship. It was a known risk. The Coast Guard had inquired in the early 1970s about some Great Lakes freighters equipped with exactly the same hatch designs after flooding incidents. The alterations included the strengthening of hatch covers and the improvement of sealing mechanisms. Some vessels made modifications rather quickly, but the reason behind it is still subject to much debate. The Fitzgerald is the one ship that has never undergone a complete retrofit. It cannot be known if the modifications weren't yet mandatory or if its operators thought her in good enough condition without them, but she was sailing with a documented vulnerability. Here was another complication, that of length.
Yes, the 729-foot ore carrier, launched in 1958, was downbound to Zug Island in the Detroit River after being loaded with 26,116 tons.
At 729 feet, the hull of the Fitzgerald is capable of flexing sufficiently in heavy seas to create small microgaps along the edges of hatches even when the covers are fastened down well. It is wonderful engineering for carrying phenomenal loads, but the result is that the seals keeping her cargo holds are constantly working under pressure during storms. The so-called green water theory, not spray but massive walls. There is water rolling across the deck. Survivors from other ships that found themselves within this storm talked of waves sweeping the length of their vessels. For a ship with hatches already under strain, that kind of water force could be devastating. At such times, the Fitzgerald's flaw was not merely theoretical, it was potentially catastrophic. Some who examined the wreck years afterward claimed to see evidence that her hatches had failed, allowing tons of water to flood in from forward holds. Others insisted that the hatches were largely intact, so a sudden structural failure was responsible for the sinking. The debate has never been fully settled, but the fact that her hatch design was on a Coast Guard watch list before she went down remains a haunting detail. Had the flaw been publicly pointed out, repercussions would have attended such an action. To admit that one of the bright stars of lake shipping had a design flaw could have raised questions on the integrity of the industry and led owners to liability. After the disaster, it was much simpler and safer for the business to blame the weather. That option left the public with a comforting story, and the flaw rested in technical reports, with a few outside the maritime community ever likely to read. Even if the flaw was known, another layer of the cover-up made sure blame never reached the shipyard. The official story versus the evidence. When the Coast Guard released its official report on the Edmund Fitzgerald's sinking, the conclusion was swift and simple. A violent storm sank the ship. To the public, it was an open and shut case. Lake Superior had claimed another victim, just as it had for centuries. The language of the report painted the Fitzgerald's loss as an unavoidable act of nature, an unfortunate but inevitable hazard of life on the Great Lakes. But when you peel back that neat narrative, a more complicated picture emerges. For one thing, the report placed overwhelming emphasis on weather conditions, downplaying mechanical failures, maintenance history, and design flaws. The storm was certainly ferocious, with sustained winds over 50 knots and waves reportedly cresting above 30 feet. But other ships in the same area, including the Arthur M. Anderson, survived. Why did the Fitzgerald vanish without a single distress call when others endured? Some sailors and investigators privately questioned the Coast Guard's certainty in the matter. Divers who investigated the wreck in the years after its discovery noted that the ship's two main sections lay on the lakebed with cargo still inside, suggesting she might have gone down intact instead of splintering on the surface as the official version of events claimed. Everything contradicted theories of her being a sudden structural failure, doomed before a call for distress signals. Then there were maintenance and design issues seemingly mentioned only in passing. Leaked internal memos pointed out that hatch cover integrity had been an issue repeatedly on several Great Lakes freighters, including some similar to the Fitzgerald. Yet, in the final conclusions, this vulnerability had been made out as a possible consideration, but not very likely as a cause. With the accusation directed at the weather, the investigation cleared the shipping industry and the Fitzgerald's owners from direct scrutiny. The testimony of the crew of the Arthur M. Anderson raised further questions. They testified that the Fitzgerald was already listing and had lost venting capability for hours before sinking. If the water was actually coming into the cargo holds, this should have been a central factor in the cause analysis. Instead, it was treated as incidental damage from the storm. The implication is clear. If flooding of significant proportions were to be acknowledged prior to the last moments, the finger could instead be pointed not at uncontrollable nature, but rather at preventable causes. Politics and economics were never too far from the surface. The Great Lakes shipping industry had become a backbone for steel production, and vessel safety was intertwined with economic viability. A report pointing to maintenance failures or recognized design faults would have undoubtedly sparked costly retrofits and legal liabilities. Malign the storm to preserve the status quo, and yet provide some closure to the grieving families. The contradictions did not end there. Photos from later expeditions revealed hatch clamps that had either gone missing entirely or become bent, propelling the theory that water intrusion played an important role. The Coast Guard accepted the images, but insisted, however, that these conditions might have resulted from the wreck's impact against the lake bottom. Critic, however, said that such uniform patterns of damage are unlikely to occur after freshwater sinking, being well placed with progressive failure through the course of the journey. In the end, the official story was a carefully crafted tale of events, one favoring a singular, uncontrollable culprit rather than a messy tangle of human decisions, mechanical failings, and corporate priorities. For decades, that tale held up quite unchallenged in the public eye. Which leaves the most haunting question of all: was the Fitzgerald's fate an accident or the result of a perfect crime? Legacy, written in steel and silence. In the years after the Edmund Fitzgerald slipped beneath Lake Superior, the official story remained fixed in the public's mind. A fierce storm, a proud ship, and a tragic loss of 29 men.
Today marks the 49th anniversary of the day 29 sailors aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald lost their lives in a storm on Lake Superior, many of whom came from Toledo.
The image was immortalized in songs, memorial services, and grainy newsreel footage of a bell tolling in the cold November air. But behind the elegy was a quieter legacy, one written in steel, policy changes, and a lingering silence about the truths left unspoken. The tragedy spurred a wave of safety reforms across the Great Lakes shipping industry. Depth finders became mandatory for ships over a certain tonnage, ensuring captains could track their position and avoid shallow hazards in poor visibility. Every crew member on large freighters was now required to have a survival suit, a grim acknowledgement that hypothermia in Superior's frigid waters claimed lives in minutes. Navigation systems were upgraded, maps and charts revised, and new weather monitoring protocols established to give ships more lead time before a storm's arrival. These upgrades would generally seem to promote safety in sailing, yet they remained unvoiced testimony to whatever fate could befall the Fitzgerald. If only the storm had been at fault, then drastic reforms such as those felt to be needed for the Fitzgerald would not have been initiated. The very existence of these upgrades was a silent acknowledgement that conditions on board Fitzgerald, while under assault, and those systems meant to protect her crew, weren't working as they should have. For the families of the men who were lost, this became a very personal legacy. A monument in honor of all 29 crew members was erected at Whitefish Point in Michigan. Their professions were engraved in stone alongside their ages. In 1995, the bell of the Fitzgerald was raised from the wreck, polished, and is now exhibited at the museum. On November 10th of each year, the bell is tolled 30 times, once for each man and once more for all sailors lost on the Great Lakes. These solemn and heartfelt tributes do not assuage the anguish of the living who still live in agony over the unanswered questions. Fitzgerald became more than just a warning to sailors. It turned out to be a barometer for danger. All vessels navigating the Great Lakes today travel in the shadow of her demise, an unvoiced reminder that even the most romanticized ships disappeared under waves. Captains speak her name in the wheelhouse when the winds begin to surge, not as a ghost story, but to remind them that steel and skill aren't everything. The silence goes on. The shipping lines, the Coast Guard, and the shipyard have all moved on from these events, their official postures largely unchanged from the 1970s. Few within those institutions have been willing to revisit the sinking on the eye toward admitting fault. A very difficult truth would need to be adopted, that the Fitzgerald loss was not wholly an act of nature, but a nexus of human decisions, overlooked warnings, and preventable design flaws. The storm didn't slay the Fitzgerald. Negligence did. Pride did. And until we admit that, we'll keep telling ourselves the same comforting lie. Like, comment, and subscribe for more untold histories, and check the video on your screen now to see another Great Lakes mystery that still raises questions.